Foucault and Biopolitics for Ireland in Revolution. This is the second to last of the lectures in Ireland in Revolution, and I'm going to use it as an opportunity to move slowly through Michel Foucault's final lecture on what he came to call biopolitics in a series of talks that he gave in 1976 that have been published under the title Society Must Be Defended. Foucault was an analyst of power, perhaps the preeminent philosopher of power, certainly the preeminent philosopher of power of his time. And he analyzed different ways in which power operated in society. And in this lecture, he refers to three different kinds of power: sovereign power, disciplinary power, and biopower. Sovereign power, as the name indicates, is the traditional power associated with a sovereign, with a king, and it becomes a version of the kind of power associated with the state. And that is the power, as he says, to let live or make die. That, in other words, and this is an analysis you'll find in Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan, and another of which, a variant of which you'll find in Max Weber's famous definition of the state as a territory in which a source of power has exerted a legitimate monopoly on violence in that territory. So that the monopoly on violence, the monopoly of the sovereign on violence, and their ability to decide who lives or dies, to let them live or make them die, is essentially what sovereign power is. If you've studied Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan, you'll know that it's a classic text in the history of what became social contract theory. And what Hobbes did in that book, in an extraordinary and audacious move, was to suggest that the sovereign acquired a monopoly on violence in the interests of his subjects rather than in their own interests. That, in other words, it was in your interests as an individual to give up your right to violence because everyone else in the state of nature, as it was called, the kind of primitive pre-civilized state of society before the social contract was inaugurated, everyone in that state of nature had a right to violence too. So yes, you had a right to violence, but you also were likely to experience violence when other people exerted their right to violence. And this untenable state of nature, which Hobbes likened to a war of all against all, as though civilization was coterminous with a certain monarchical conception of it. This war of all against all ended when a sovereign acquired a monopoly on the right to violence and then used it in order to defend his subjects from each other and themselves. So it became possible, in Hobbes's view, for you to be killed by the sovereign in your own interests. And that's the audacious and extraordinary achievement of the book Leviathan. So sovereign power is the kind of power that you see in Gladiator when the Roman emperor, although I haven't seen the film, but I'm assuming this happens at least once, either sticks his thumb up to say that the gladiator can live, or it's a thumbs down to say that the gladiator can be put to death. And the idea that that audacious gesture resides in the provenance of one individual is sovereign power, the quintessential moment of sovereign power. It is at the moment, he says, when the sovereign can kill, that he exercises his right over life. It is essentially the right of the sword, the right to take life or let live. The second kind of power that Foucault was interested in was what he called disciplinary power. And this is closely indexed to the rise of capitalism. Capitalism was about the invention of private property, the seizing and enclosure of the commons, and then what happened next was that all of the people who had been displaced from the land that they had held in common now found themselves with nowhere to go. At the same time, then, homelessness was made illegal, the vagrancy laws. So you had this, and this is a kind of a very compressed and inadequate history of a process. So you had a situation where land was seized, rendered private, people are displaced, homelessness is made illegal, and all of a sudden, people need a place to live. And the compromise is that they can return to the land as long as they work for the person who now owns the land. And this sets up Karl Marx's great analysis of the property owner and the worker in Das Kapital. Needless to say, initially, and for very good reason, and perhaps to this day, people have an inherent resistance to the idea that it is their job to work for somebody else, that the natural state of society requires and demands of them that they give their lives over to the task of alienated labor, as Marx calls it, for other people. Alienated labor in Marx's analysis was any work that you didn't want to do but were told you had to do. That you were alienated from it as a process, that you were alienated from the product because you didn't get to keep it, that it alienated you from yourself because you didn't want to be doing it and you were wasting your life, and that it alienated you from other people because it turned you into a lonely, isolated, alienated worker in a process of production that was now organized not around making things that were useful, what Marx called use value, but around things that could be sold for profit, what Marx called exchange value. And in that ridiculously brief history of Marxism, a whole set of powers began to be elaborated in order to turn people into individuals in a social contract with rights, but yes, they also had suddenly responsibilities. And those responsibilities included the responsibility to pay for their own reproduction and subsistence. And in order to get the money to do that, they had to work. And so disciplinary power was the means by which people were turned into individuals and then disciplined to become workers. So that what disciplinary power does in Foucault's analysis is it grabs hold of the body and disciplines and trains it. He uses the example of dressage, military institutions, but disciplinary power includes things like asylums, prisons, hospitals, schools, the workplace, factories, laws. It includes concepts of individual responsibility, sobriety, work ethic. It's an entire way of turning an animal called the human into a responsible human, a reliable human, and one who can be relied upon to work their life away as a source of profit for somebody else. You can imagine how that takes a long time to drum into people, and people were extremely resistant to it. Gradually, however, over the period of centuries, disciplinary power asserted itself. And now, through things like schools and universities, from a very early age, people are trained into accepting the idea that they exist to work for the greater good, which is, of course, the good of the few. And that's disciplinary power. And disciplinary power asserts itself directly on the body. Biopower, the third kind, and the subject of this lecture on the 17th of March that we're looking at, is different from disciplinary power because it's the power that occurs, as Foucault says, when the biological comes under state control. In other words, biopower is government of the population as population. You don't seize individual bodies, you legislate for the entire population at once, and you control their actions through large-scale interventions at the level of policy, state policy. For our purposes, so just before I say that, Foucault makes a very satisfying distinction between sovereign power, the right to take life or let live, and biopower, which he calls the power to make live and let die. That's the distinction. The right of sovereignty was the right to take life or let live, and then this new right is established, the right to make live and to let die. Anyone who's lived under a pandemic, like the Spanish flu or the coronavirus, will understand biopolitics implicitly, because biopolitics is the politics of governments responding to something like the COVID pandemic at the level of state policy. Biopolitics brings in a huge set of new questions, like how much can the state afford to care? How much is an individual life worth? How much must we spend to save lives? How many lives must we lose to save the economy? We're not going to kill anyone because that's illegal. We're going to let them die instead. That most obscene distinction, but one that you can see, for example, in Israeli policy in Palestine, where they just don't kill you, they just close off the checkpoint between you and the cancer hospital and let you die. Where 97% of water is unfit for human consumption, but we're not killing you, we're just letting you kill yourself by starving you of the necessary resources to give you a dignified life. This is biopolitics. Make live, what does that mean? Well, for example, in Ireland, and this is an example that's relevant to Yeats, and one of the things that Yeats, as an Irish Protestant, was extremely exercised by, was state policies on contraception. For reasons that are complicated and to do with Ireland's colonial history, bearing in mind that Ireland had been colonized by Puritans, Reformation Protestants, and that it had come to resist colonization in an appeal to its status as a Catholic nation, Catholicism being one of the ways in which the Irish organized an identity in opposition to Protestant imperialism, a so-called Catholic nationalism. It was not surprising that Catholicism played a defining role in the Irish nation. And this is one of the reasons why Yeats turned against it and was so horrified by it. We've seen this again and again in our appeals to the Republican ballad tradition. Republicanism being in its origins a secular tradition, precisely not about religion, but containing freedom of religion. That you were Irish, and we are all Irish, and it doesn't matter if you're Protestant, Presbyterian, Dissenter, Catholic. And over this period of the 19th century into the 20th century, this secular republicanism was overtaken by a kind of Catholic nationalist movement. So that one of the things that the Irish government did as soon as it began to legislate for itself as an Irish Free State was to enshrine Catholic laws, canon laws, into state law. One of the biggest mistakes the Irish government's made, and one set of mistakes that Ireland has paid a huge price for and is only now beginning to undo, is to conflate church and state, to make politicians the equivalent of priests and priests the equivalent of politicians. So that contraception, if you ban it, is one way of making people live. They call it pronatalism. And if you're interested in studying this issue further, you can go to the Dáil debates and the Senate debates in Ireland. In 1928, there was a censorship of publications bill, which was going to censor literature, another thing that Yeats was obviously horrified by. It was going to censor any kind of immoral literature, literature calculated to deprave the reader, as they put it, putting an awful lot of faith in literature at the time, that actually reading a naughty book could turn you into a naughty person. But the bill also contained prohibitions against literature advocating contraception. Bear in mind that Yeats's Prayer for My Daughter, as we have seen, already indicates that he was extremely preoccupied by biopolitics, by the politics of reproduction, sexual and social. And one of the reasons why he had this prayer for his daughter was he was keenly interested in preventing her from marrying the wrong kind of person and having the wrong kind of baby, i.e. a mixed marriage with a Catholic, that would lead to the reproduction of a Catholic nation using Protestant sexual and social resources. So that biopolitics, as analyzed by Foucault in this lecture, is an extremely astute way to theorize what happens in Ireland when Irish, after the War of Independence and the disastrous Civil War, a split nation comes to govern itself under the name of an independent Irish Free State and begins to express its independence by allowing its Catholic or Catholicism, to find expression in laws, like the censorship of publications. There was even a bill in the 1930s, a Dance Hall Act, which made it illegal to have a dance without the permission of a priest and a priest in attendance. Dancing, of course, being in W. Bernard Shaw's famous formulation, the vertical expression of a horizontal desire. Jazz music was the music of the devil. It got pretty stupid, as these things tend to do, when you allow people like priests who have an authority that has been accorded to them by an institution called the church, rather than anything preeminent in their souls or prognostications. And when you put these people in charge of people's souls, the biopolitics of souls, under the name of state legislature, you get a theocracy. And this is where Ireland was going. And this is what Yeats hated about it, the Paugenes and the biddies. So what this entire essay of Foucault's is about is his analysis of the origins of this biopolitics. This notion that he was no longer, it's not disciplinary power, as he suggests here. It's not interested in man as body, but man as living being. So that we get not an anatomopolitics of the human body, as in training, dressage, drilling, military, schools with times you had to be there, penalties for missing school, desks in a row, lessons, homework, all of that stuff. Uniforms of practice, uniforms of code. But it's this biopolitics. A biopolitics of birth control, natalist policies, morbidity, an entire set of policies that were indexed to a fear that we've been studying a lot in this course, the fear of degeneration. Biopolitics is a politics of generation, by which we mean the production of population. Most of the nations in the turn of the century and into the 20th century believed the degeneration hypothesis was happening. They believed that nations were in decline, or that decline was an ever-present threat in the body politic of the nation. We've studied this through Nordau. Nordau is being a privileged text for us because it so cleanly and clearly lays out the extremely confused hypothesis of degeneration. After all, degenerates were supposed to be runty, dissipate weaklings who somehow had managed to steal a march on the fit in the race for fitness. So how can the unfit outstrip the fit in the production of offspring if the unfit are unfit to reproduce? This was the problem of degeneration theory. Well, the answer, of course, was to find within the body politic this threat, the degenerate. So biopolitics, indexed to nationalism, was a set of practices evoked or invoked by a nation in order to prevent the threat of degeneration at the level of the nation. It's about, in other words, regenerating the nation. So when you look at a poem like Sailing to Byzantium, where you have that lovely phrase at the start, those dying generations, we're speaking here about the specter of degeneration. Population, these permanent factors, as Foucault says, which sap the population's strength. And of course, degeneration, once it becomes biologized, once Darwin comes along, people feel that suddenly they understand how degeneration works. It's about unfit or unnatural selection. In Ireland, for example, Yeats could easily look at the Irish nation and say, well, one reason why Ireland is in decline is because the best, you'll recall this from Plato's Republic, the best are no longer knitted to the best, and anyone who wants to have a baby with anyone can have one. Breeding, in other words, is not being controlled in the interests of the Republic. This is where we get to notions of public hygiene, and to notions of forced sterilization, and to positive eugenics, and to negative eugenics. Positive eugenics is when you allow the best to breed with the best. Negative eugenics is when you prevent the worst from breeding with the worst or with the best. Clearly, Yeats thought his daughter was one of the best, and the threat that she faced in Ireland was a set of feckless, randy Irish so-and-sos who embodied everything that was the worst, and didn't understand anything about contraception, and even if they did understand contraception, wouldn't use it because their church and state didn't allow it. And when I went to university in Ireland in 1992 in Trinity College Dublin, there was still an effective ban on contraception in society. When I was at the university, they introduced condom vending machines into the university, and then you weren't allowed to use them, so you could look at them. You could look at contraception when I was at university, but it was extremely difficult to purchase. Around that time was the time when they finally came to their senses and just began to make it available. But you can imagine for a long time after that, it still remained extremely shameful. And shame is another aspect of Irish culture around these issues that bears a lot of scrutiny. And Yeats spends a lot of his time in his poetry shaming Ireland. So, another aspect of biopolitics, and I'm just moving through this quickly, is what he calls the control of the environment. That degeneration, and if you go back to Max Nordau, you'll see this very clearly in the early chapters, is a kind of an urban problem. One of the problems with degeneration theory was that degeneration didn't actually exist. This didn't stop Hitler from defining 6 million people as degenerates and killing them, so it was fairly effective in its inexistence. But a bit like concepts like race, made up ideas that acquire a social reality through the discursive power of their inventors come to exert a deadly effect on a society in which they may not have any actual positive material existence at all. So what was degeneration theory trying to say or do or respond to? Well, there was a perceived sense that humanity was under stress. And this, Foucault would argue, and I think he's correct here, what they were actually noticing was the effects of industrial capitalism on human nature or on the human body. That this alienated labor in alienated surroundings for less and less money and more work, with pollution and crime and drugs and alcoholism and dissolution, all of this was happening. But rather than seeing it as a function of the industrial capitalist system, they saw it as a function of biology. Biology at the intersection of population. Too many people in too small spaces, not enough ventilation. So instead, for example, of closing the factories, you had to give them more windows, circulate air through them, and so forth. So that this new biopolitics of government was, for Foucault, the main invention or elaboration of the 19th century. And it gave us the degeneration hypothesis, but it also gave us a kind of way of dealing with that hypothesis. That there was an innate equilibrium or tendency towards homeostasis that had been demonstrated in biology, and that what biopolitics had to do at the level of state policy was to inaugurate policies that would achieve and maintain a homeostasis of the social and political body. One of the more disastrous problems of the biological age post-Darwin was the transference of Darwinian theory from the state of nature, where it operated, into an analysis of society where it didn't. Treating society like a version of nature is disastrous. Darwinian fitness and selection only operate in those kinds of natural environments, where, for example, if you happen to be a fox and you happen to be albino, and then it happens to snow for 3 years in a row, you actually gain unwittingly an advantage of camouflage that makes it less likely for you to be selected for death. But But if you're an albino in a situation in which the snow doesn't come and everyone else happens to be born the color of the autumn branches, and this is a spurious example, then they have an advantage of camouflage, and you being white and sticking out are more likely to be selected for extinction. Natural selection, with descent through modification leading to evolution. But evolution is not about progress. No one's saying that the changes in a bird's constitution make it better or morally improve it. They just make it more likely to survive. And that's what fitness was. Once you transpose the biological to the social and it gets transposed onto narratives of progress, you'll see the disastrous conflation now of the idea that there's a biological drag on human progress being levied against the species by the unfit within it, and that these have to be selected out. And rather than letting nature do it, we're going to let the government do it, or Hitler do it, or Netanyahu do it, or whoever has taken upon themselves the right to arrogate the process of conducting and managing the fitness of the species and of getting rid of the other, the racialized other, the sexualized other, the medicalized other, the vagrant, the homeless, the loafer, the unemployable worker. The problem with degeneration theory was that it was a species of lookism. You could tell who was degenerate just by looking at them, and you knew what to do with them. You got rid of them so that your species began to look fitter, happier, more productive, and so forth. It was intimately linked to the notion that if you weren't productive, you weren't fit to be a member of society. Sadly, all of this has made a resurgence under neoliberalism in the guise of the withdrawal or the punishing of poverty through the withdrawal of the welfare state. The idea that we're not going to kill you, we're just going to let you die by withdrawing your social benefits, for example. You'll see this happening in Brexit Britain, but it happened in North America generally under Reagan, and in England under Thatcher, and across the world. The idea that poverty was a state of unfitness, that you couldn't kill them, of course, because that's fascism, but you could reduce their benefits. You could invest in the market and in productive individuals and let the poor sink or swim on the understanding that inevitably they would sink. So biopolitics is a fairly sinister development in Western civilization, and it has a kind of a relentless common sense logic to it. It appears as though it's a progressive movement because what it's suggesting it's doing is making society progressively fitter. It's a kind of negative check on degeneracy, exercised from within state policy. Now, at this point, Foucault makes a link to sexuality. Why, and the Irish Free State is a great example of this, and Yeats's A Prayer for My Daughter is only one example of this in his work. We'll see it in Purgatory, is the last play we're going to be studying. Why sexuality? Why did people become obsessed with sexuality? And there's an important sense in which sexuality itself was invented at the same time as biopolitics. The idea that sexuality was invented might seem counterintuitive to a sexually reproductive species, but what Foucault means here is that concepts like homosexuality, heterosexuality, in fact, a vast nomenclature of human sexuality was invented at the turn of the 19th century. There were no heterosexuals before about 1884, and there were no homosexuals before around 1887 or 1888 or something. I can't remember the specific dates. Anyone interested could go to Foucault's famous 3-volume History of Sexuality. But sexology, it was called, and it was a new science, part of psychiatric power. And the reason why sexuality exploded as a concept was this notion of productivity. As Foucault says, if disciplinary power is about the government of the body as body, and biopower or biopolitics is the government of the people as population, sexuality is the site of intersection between the body and the population. And this is when society began to exert an exorbitant or inordinate interest in female bodies, the maternal body, the female body, as the site of the reproduction of the individual, the species, the nation, the society, and so forth. As he says, sexuality exists at the point where population and body meet. This explains a lot about A Prayer for My Daughter. Yeats's preoccupation with Protestant ascendancy, his preoccupation with national degeneracy, his preoccupation with Catholic ignorance, fecklessness, and feckless fecundity, all of these things come to be mediated through a preoccupation with his daughter's body, her uterus, the contents of her womb, its products, and its future. May she be like a flourishing hidden tree, rooted in one dear perpetual place. That there's an authoritarianism to Yeats's poem, which is the authoritarianism of a father managing his daughter as resources for the clan, the Anglo-Irish people. But you can see how this is linked to managing who gets to have babies and with whom. It's a Darwinism of the uterus. And that's what biopolitics and disciplinary power asserted on the body come to mean, a preoccupation with sexuality as a site of possibility, but also as a site of crisis. That yes, the female body is something extraordinarily powerful, necessary, and a precondition of our future, but for those very reasons, we need to manage it, to govern it, to make sure it doesn't become wayward. And the whole disastrous preoccupation in modern Ireland with fallen women and unmarried mothers that you'll see in the history of the Magdalens is an expression or an index and a consequence of this biopolitics of nationalism. So that this Foucauldian analysis of biopower is an extremely powerful way to think through the problems of modern Ireland and Yeats's response to them. The disciplinary and regulatory effects of biopower are everywhere evinced in Yeats's late work. Shockingly so in Purgatory, as we shall see, in which a man stabs his own son because he believes himself to be the product of a contaminated union between his mother, who was a woman of a big house, and a stable hand who wasn't fit to be the father of her child. This is in 1938 on the eve of World War II, so you can see how Yeats's work is now swirling around in a greater world of Nazi legislation and what would soon come to be the final solution. This brings us to issues of form and the body and deformity, and brings us back to Kathleen Ní Houliháin, as I'll be talking about in my lecture on Yeats' able nationalism and fascism. An important thing to remember about the Hitler purge is that Hitler's first victims were Germans, and they were Germans with deformities, inverted commas, and disabilities. In other words, they were the Germans who presented an internal threat to the fitness of the German nation. He went after Jews later. His first victims were Germans themselves, but they were unfit Germans, Germans who did not represent an index of productivity, beauty, fitness that a fit, regenerating nation required. So, and towards the end of his lecture then, Foucault brings in a supremely important concept of the norm and a normalizing society. That normalizing societies are societies that find new ways to govern that are not about intervention, arrest, incarceration, but around discipline and regulation through normality, normalization. Heterosexuality, for example, is a great way to understand this problem. What homosexuality is an invention of the late 19th century. That doesn't mean that people of the same sex weren't making out like crazy for as long as we've been a species. It means that at a certain point, the act, for example, of sodomy, and let's just take the example of to what are called men having anal sex, the practice of sodomy, as it was called in a slightly judgy kind of way. It's not that sodomy hadn't been happening, it's that at a certain point, if you practiced sodomy, that became an index of your true identity, making you a homosexual. So that what Foucault says is that sexual acts become sexual identities. And this is what sexology was. It was a way of taking any sexual act that wasn't indexed immediately to sexual reproduction, and you can smell Catholic Ireland on the breeze here, and pathologizing them. So that obviously anal sex is a problem, and I'm saying obviously here in inverted commas. Obviously anal sex is a problem because you can't have a baby through anal sex, and the nation needs babies, and the whole point of sex is to reproduce babies, and the whole point of babies is to reproduce national identity, and the whole point of national identity is national health and fitness and the future. So that anything that wasn't heterosexuality in the missionary position, lie back and think of Ireland's sex, became pathologized. And this happened all over Europe, and psychiatry played a predominant role in it. People like Krafft-Ebing's Psychopathia Sexualis was just a person who sounds a lot like he never had sex himself, indexing every possible aberration in sex that you could imagine and making it the basis for disciplinary power, incarceration, confinement to an asylum. And that was at the extreme end. And the Magdalens, of course, is a great example of that, because think of a woman who gets pregnant and is called an unmarried mother. That's a discursive construction, suggesting that you could only or should only have sex within marriage for the purposes of reproduction. So in Ireland, this was policed by the church and schools and state policy and social norms, and Ireland became a normalizing society. Yeats is intensely interested in normalizing society too, and that's why he's so interested in the prayer for my daughter in the notions of custom and ceremony, because customs and ceremonies are the ways in which societies produce and police norms. It's not normal for you to have sex unless your parents know the person and have approved and think that you would make a good match. And it's not normal for Protestants to have sex with Catholics, and it's not normal, etc., etc., etc. So that normalizing people, producing in them shame about their own desire because they don't have the right kind of normal desires, is a huge aspect of how biopolitics operates. It was a new source of discipline and regulation that comes along with biopower. In the end of the lecture, Foucault goes into Nazism and racism. That basically his point is biopower requires racism or appeals to racism as a way of making a discrimination within the population of those that deserve to be let live and those that deserve to be let die. There are certain, and this goes back, if you go back to Plato's Republic, you'll see that those who are to be made live, encouraged to breed, are the best. And those that are to be let die, or to be made die, in Hitler's formulation, are the worst. But nobody is in any doubt anymore about who the best and the worst are, and it's indexed to a theory of genetics, fitness, national health, heredity, public hygiene, sexual normalcy, and so forth. Yeats is right there in the mix with all of this. So that positive and negative eugenics become central to the common sense of what degeneration means, with disastrous impact on our society. For Foucault, in a normalizing society, race or racism is the precondition that makes killing acceptable. Foucault has a different theory of race than the one you might be familiar with. He talks about internal and external racism, that racism is about a society deciding who on the outside doesn't fit. So, for example, asylum seekers, Black people, Muslims, don't let them in here, they're not fit to be here, etc. But there are also internal enemies. Protestants, alcoholics, weirdos, queers, you name it. Anyone you don't like can kind of become an internal enemy. The internal enemy of the nation is very rarely oneself. You'll notice that there's never been a society that has produced a racial hierarchy and located itself somewhere in the middle or at the bottom. There's a hierarchy of races, and we're number 7. Most of the time, what you'll see is that the promulgator of the theory of racial preeminence assumes their place at the top. Hitler, though he himself was no athlete, not a particularly prepossessing person, never for a second doubted Germans as the preeminent race. And he was obsessed with the Greeks, with the Greek body, the Greek male athletic body of the great discus throwing statues of Athens and Rome, in those great collections that you see all over that part of the world from that period. He was obsessed with them as a kind of an ideal type, that Germans had looked like the Greeks, and they would look like the Greeks again after he'd finished killing all the abnormals. Because this is the source of the abnormal. The abnormal becomes whatever the normal isn't, which is a disastrous formulation of what health might look like. And this is where contraception, voluntary and involuntary sterilization, all of these ways of policing the stock. You'll remember that Stephen Harper made a reference to settler stock in his last attempt to get re-elected. That is the beginnings of normalizing society, the politics of reproduction, and state fascism or state racism. So that Foucault says that in a normalizing society, predicated on biopolitics and the management of populations, killing becomes inevitable, the right to kill. But he's talking here about not just killing in the sense of murder, as he says, he talks about indirect murder, the fact of exposing someone to death, for example, contaminated drinking water in Gaza, increasing the risk of death for some people, for example, allowing the police to shoot with impunity in the Black Lives Matter movement, or quite simply, political death, expulsion, rejection, and so on, exile, shaming, cancel culture, these kinds of things. So there in Society Must Be Defended is an extraordinary analysis of what biopolitics is. And I hope you'll begin to understand why this kind of analysis is super helpful in understanding the career of Yeats. And some say that it's helpful in understanding late Yeats, when he gets older, more preoccupied with authority. As a function of his own sexual impotence, he becomes more preoccupied with potency, sexuality, that is no country for old men, the young in one another's arms, and so forth. And that he kind of turns to authoritarianism and lookism and eugenics and degeneration theory as he gets older. But the truth is, as we've seen in this course, it's there from the very beginnings in Kathleen Ni Houlihan and on Bias Strand. That notion of the hawk and fitness and breeding and Cuchulainn and children and Connor and his children, biopolitics has been there with Yeats from the beginning. It takes a fascist turn as biopolitics itself took a fascist turn in the 1900s up through the 20s and into the 30s. And by the 1930s, Yeats was praising Nazi legislation and accepting awards like the Goethe Placket from the Nazi government. So there's a huge, complicated debate in Irish studies, of course, about how to exonerate Yeats from complicity with fascism. And many people get themselves into very dubious places by trying to say, oh, he was a poet who was mostly preoccupied with aesthetic form. I think we'll see that he was, of course, preoccupied with aesthetic form, but he was also preoccupied with physical form. And we know this from A Prayer for My Daughter. May she have beauty, yet not beauty to make a stranger's eye distraught. Anytime Plato wanted to define truth, he referred his reader to beauty, as if beauty was something we all understood implicitly. It was a kind of implicit norm, an implicit form for Plato of the good. Plato is the place to go for a conflation of beauty, truth, and goodness. And as we'll see in the lecture by Simona Forti on biopolitics of souls, Nazism was a kind of Platonic philosophy of race. And Yeats shared a Platonic philosophy of race. If you go to those poems from the period of the Civil War and the War of Independence, in The Tower, that book in which he takes the symbol of a besieged and defensive battlement structure, the house he had built in Tourbalili, and holds himself up there with his wife and his children as the filthy modern tyrant of Ireland comes to his door, the irregulars, the Free State soldiers, you'll see that Yeats appeals to Plato because he's interested in protecting ideal form from contamination by the material. We're back here to the notion of the School of Athens, Raphael's painting, where Aristotle is pointing at the soil and Plato is pointing at the sky. Confronting Ireland, confronting the turn to Catholic nationalism in Ireland, confronting the realization that Ireland was a nation of grubby shopkeepers and violent Calibans, Yeats increasingly began to cultivate a politics of Platonic idealism, that the race was inherently degenerate or degenerating or open, vulnerable to degeneration, and so it need the resources of the race, in this case the Anglo-Irish, need to be managed from within, biopolitically, and through discipline if necessary. And ultimately, in the Hitlerian version and in Purgatory, through sovereign power. When you're reading Purgatory, I would invite you to think of when do we hear about biopower, a preoccupation with breeding? When do we hear about disciplinary power, a preoccupation with people's bodies and the control of their bodies? And when do we hear about sovereign power, the power to take life, to kill? All three are at play in that late play by Yeats, and all three bear scrutiny. So I've posted on Brightspace Foucault's last lecture from this book, Society Must Be Defended. It's an extraordinary text, and it's of interest to anyone who's interested in literature from around 1870 onwards, because Foucault really here diagnoses the origins of fascism, but also of state racism in Stalinism and in Ireland, where, for example, a muted version of fascism occurs around women and their sexual rights and their uteruses and their ability to have the right kind of babies, and what do we do with the wrong kind of babies, and what do we do with the women who have the wrong kind of babies. All of this played out in Ireland in a version of the normalizing society and internal racism. That because Ireland was a new nation, a new generation had to be produced that would demonstrate to the world and to ourselves our fitness, our ability to govern, and our refutation of all of the colonial stereotypes of the English, going back to that notion of that cartoon of the two rivals that we saw early in the course. You remember that cartoon was a young, helpless woman being proposed to by one man who had flowers and a parliamentary bill, and behind her lay the threat of violence and a kind of simian ape. That cartoon in Irish independence becomes a preoccupation with Irish women as the bearers of the Irish nation to come. And as a result of that, there would be a preoccupation with female conduct as if women were both the site and source of the Irish nation and of Irish contamination. And that disastrous conflation becomes the history of modern Ireland. Yeats is there, and for his own purposes is refracting it through a discourse of Protestant ascendancy. And that will lead us to his final play, Purgatory, and we're going to circle back to Kathleen Ní Houliháin to look at that fateful moment when blood sacrifice turns an aging old woman who's lost everything to a young woman with the walk of a queen who's about to come into her land, who's about to come into possession of her future. She will be, in other words, Ireland will be regenerated by blood sacrifice. And that sounds a lot like what Hitler was about to say about Germany.